Hello, everyone. All right, let me just get this started. I'm going to since we're an organization of the Moving Image, I'm going to let the Moving Image do the introduction for what New Frontier is.
For years, we had a division of Sundance where we were just showing the technology. On the other side was the art itself.
This is enormous emergence of technology and how it was changing the moving image.
We saw the beginning of an explosion of artists working in different forms of media.
We've created this fully immersive cinematic venue, an experiment of sorts.
There are new forms of storytelling. We're on this path, and we're not quite sure where it's taking us.
We really need a place, artists and filmmakers who want to just completely take a risk, try something absolutely new.
Our job and our role is to create a space and a platform to bring new voices and new ways of seeing the world to this place.
A new media landscape was really changing how works were being made, how works were being shown, how works were even playing a role in society.
Changing the technology becomes more capable of delivering the work you imagine. And what you see is a sense of wonder. You see wonder.
This year, it's much more sculptural, much more engaging with the body, telling stories that are completely divergent from the traditional proscenium format.
The artists who are breaking boundaries are the artists who don't even know what it is they're doing, but they're doing it.
For those of you who don't know, we also have, for the past 2 years, a lab dedicated to New Frontier work now.
We could bring this incredible community of artists working in so many different disciplines and creative practices where they could push the boundaries of their work and of storytelling.
Our sense of discovery, our sense of independent expression, our sense of curiosity. This is what the artists bring to this environment.
Over the last 10 years, we've got this explosion of platforms, this adoption of transmedia by master storytellers. This is a moment in time that never existed before.
We've been part of the technology trail for over 25 years. It's been interesting to see how things have evolved.
Ocular evolution is a leap in the ability of storytellers to bring the viewer inside the frame of the story world.
It's a brave new world, so be brave. Take a shot. It's out there for you to grab.
The possibilities, pushing the boundaries. We're just at the edge of the next frontier.
Let's see what happens. Let's see where the artists take us.
So that gives you a sense of what New Frontier has been over the last 10 years, and I want to talk a little bit about where we're trying to go over the next 10 years. And I have to say that it's a real interesting position to have to follow Aaron Koblin, because he was actually one of my mentors when I came to the lab as an artist in 2011 at the New Frontier Story Lab, and he's actually been one of the key artists that have been pioneering this path of the intersection of art and technology and storytelling and technology in such a phenomenal way that he's our poster child for New Frontier. So to follow you is a great honor. I'm happy to still be in this space that you kind of helped usher me into so many years ago. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how New Frontier, and I have to say that Shari Freelo is the founder of New Frontier and the chief curator, and she's not here today because she's setting up for an exhibition at the moment that's happening on Monday called Slithering Screens and Films That Slither Off the Screens. And I just want to talk a little bit about how we think about our curatorial practice, right? So we understand that story only exists within a communication architecture. Tabitha Jackson, who's the head of our documentary film program, says that story does not exist until it has been heard. So there's something that we all understand about whether it be oral storytelling or something as complex as the things that we're seeing now with VR and augmented reality and transmedia storytelling. There's this need to transfer my emotions, my thoughts, my images, my imagination through some medium to another person. And so at New Frontier, we're following the evolution of that communication architecture, particularly following the artists as they hack into it, as they remix it and totally kind of appropriate it to do that thing of transferring their emotions, their heart, their story, their creation, whatever's in their head, and having it go through that transference process into somebody else's mind, heart, soul, however you want to define it. And so if we know that story exists in that kind of communication architecture, you know, how has that communication architecture evolved over the last 10 years? How will it evolve over the next 10 years is a key part of our daily questions at New Frontier. And also how are artists utilizing that architecture to not only replicate how stories were told on previous platforms or in previous mediums, but how are they really finding out what is truly native about that medium and what stories need to be told on that medium, because not all of the stories do. Sometimes a traditional book or using a pen and paper is the best medium for a particular story or a way of transferring that imagination to another person. And so we're constantly having to ask those questions so that we get past the whiz bang and the gizmos and all the things that are kind of at the hype of this innovation space and find out where the soul is in that machine and what really kind of gives us those meaningful and resonant experiences. And so just over that, I'm just going to do a kind of a brief overview of what we have been seeing in our job of following these artists into this brave new world, into this unknown space. We've seen transmedia storytelling, obviously, has been happening for a long time, over a decade, and watching how artists are constantly trying to understand how a particular character or story can live over multiple platforms and can communicate with us in different ways on those platforms in a specific way to enhance the overarching purpose of that piece. We're seeing a lot of omnidirectional storytelling, the idea of getting away from the linear narrative, the 3-act structure, going from what I call looking at story like a horizon to being out in outer space, where you have just absolute freedom in terms of your orientation and the way that you navigate that. It's interestingly touchable media, even though we're getting into screenless, kind of technologies. Touchable media still has this incredible effect on the human being when they're engaged in this kind of art form. This particular piece, we had a number of years ago where Lynette Walworth, the artist, interviewed, I think it was something like 10 women that had been through some of the worst atrocities that a human being could go through, whether it be genocide, rape, war. And she had their stories written down in a book. So you walk into a gallery space and you actually turn the pages of this text-based book and you read their stories. And so a lot of your own imagination becomes part of that point of understanding or understanding that transference. And then you walk up to a blank screen, you put your hand on it, and that woman walks out of the darkness and puts her hand on your hand. And this had such a profound effect. So they're still seeing that there is something important about how our bodies physically relate to this media. We've seen participatory storytelling in the case of we launched Hit Record and helped them to support them over their different iterations. And they have 500,000 people participating in a co-creation process. And as Aaron talked about earlier, the Johnny Cash Project, we still hold up as one of the classics in figuring out what are the right constraints around the kind of all of the different options that an interactive storytelling kind of experience can have, to constrain it enough so that you have over 2 million people participate in the same creation process and nobody fails. You don't have that degradation of the art form. Everything remains at that place that really touches your heart and resonates. And that's what's so exciting about the New Frontier space, is we're trying to follow those artists that are finding the best practices and finding the language that will help us understand what the best form is for those mediums. We feel fine, data visualization, database storytelling. How do you sort through the billions of terabytes of data that are being generated by humanity through their devices and understand what is human about us? What is a perspective on humanity that no one perspective, and storytelling perspective is everything? How can that data that we're generating as an organism called humanity, how can it tell us something about ourselves that we may not be able to understand as an individual within that kind of mass? And so it's really interesting to see how artists are trying to frame that in a way, or trying to create a process for us to understand that human story. Physical cinema, gestural-based stuff that is something that's super functional, like what we had with Tamper. Dr. John Underkoffler, who actually imagined Minority Report technology, then decided to try to bring it into reality. And then to see that evolve into something as beautiful as Chris Milk's Treachery of Sanctuary, where you're actually turning that idea of a gestural-based relationship with a body and a screen and the moving image into poetry, into this sense of liberation, to this sense of kind of connectivity that actually makes you feel more human than otherwise. We're also looking at those artists that are doing the co-creation with the algorithm and trying to understand how does those beginnings of AI start to fit into the creative process, and what does that mean ethically? What does that mean? So I was really pleased with the presentation earlier to see how you're thinking about it. Trying to understand where the beginning and the end happens between the human and the machine. Interactive cinematic languages are starting to evolve that are becoming more seamless. That idea of branching narrative is not becoming this choose your own adventure where you start to kind of have to make a choice that takes you out of the story and out of the experience, but actually allows you to feel deeper engaged with that. We're seeing, this is the same kind of idea with The Last Hijack, which won an interactive Emmy, following a Somalian pirate through his decision-making about whether to continue in that field, in that career or not. Geolocative storytelling has been a really interesting area of exploration. This is The Silent History, which was a beautifully written novel where you get to co-create with the editor as you traverse certain parts of the country, Grand Central Station and different areas, and when you're in that spot, you start to see how the story unfolds with the landscape or the architecture that's there, and then you get to actually contribute and co-create and edit and start to create geo-specific, geocached content that it kind of extends that story. Even works that we didn't get to curate ourselves, but we were really enamored with, such as the National Mall, where you're seeing a specific geo-aware musical composition where as you navigate around this space, you start to hear different versions of how this one song, this one composition can manifest. I think one of our dear friends, Chris Holmes, who had done a parallel composition, had to create 400 different strands of one single song to create that kind of interactivity in music and composition. And something that we're really interested in, that I think we're still very much at the beginning of, is how does story exist in the world of connected objects, in the world of smart objects. I think this piece by Vincent Morissette was a really interesting kind of glimpse into what that looks like when your cell phone was able to kind of manipulate the lights and manipulate the image in the music video that Arcade Fire did, and then to have your image jump into the laptop that you were watching it on and have the protagonist jump into your cell phone. The idea of, as smart objects and screens and all that stuff starts to proliferate with AR and VR, how will characters live in our world with us? How will we have Hamlet in our pocket for, over days, and how will Hamlet live within the architecture around us and the environmental, and the objects around us? Another example was Lance Wheeler's Leica, where kids from around the world interacted with a smart toy, and we're able to create stories and kind of help him, guide him on this narrative. We're interested in data visualization, real-time analytics. We're interested in bioresponsive technology. How the heck is that gonna work, right? So in this piece by Yehuda Duenas, he wanted to recreate that sense of what a performer has, the state that a performer has to be in when they go onto stage, which is really calm and centered while they're dealing with all the stimuli, lights and sounds and all of this. And so he created a contraption where when you put on the EEG machine or whatever it is on your head, and as your body goes into a state of calm, into a state of what I like to say zen, your body rises in the air, and then the stimulation starts to happen, and you start to get lights and sounds and ticker tapes. But you have to maintain that inner sense of calm in order to stay in that state. So how is that kind of idea going to start to play into story experiences and crafting story architecture? Recently, I heard about the VR experience at CES where they actually did intravenous, they gave you serotonin and those kinds of, did you guys hear about this? Where you're in a VR experience and they're actually manipulating your own chemicals in your body to get you to a certain place. That's also where you got some ethical lines that we're trying to manage. And then, of course, this idea of virtual reality and altered body experiences. This piece by Birdley, which Swiss Next brought to Sundance, was incredibly powerful, I think, as a first glimpse at what does it mean to have that altered body experience. How do we really lose sense of our own gravity and our own physical relationship with the world and to embody that of a bird. We had a 10-hour wait at Sundance because it was such a compelling experience. And then the idea of, as light-filled technology emerges, what does it mean to walk into the moving image, to have the same kind of agility inside of a captured picture that you would inside of a rendered environment. Obviously, we all have seen what the promise of augmented reality and the future of computing platforms and the future of communication that will come with that kind of, these new kinds of tools. And we're really excited to support artists as they're trying to figure out what does that mean for story and what does that mean for story architecture. So we definitely believe that we're always gonna be in this diverse media landscape, whether you have vintage media like books and the like, all the way up to things that are as amazing as Aaron Copland's Light Echo. And we're also gonna have to contend with this idea of what does it mean to be a cyborg? What does it mean to actually integrate all this technology and your body inside the architecture of a story? And what does it mean to be superhuman, right? So I'm sure you guys are familiar with Neil. He's an official cyborg. And when I had a conversation with him and I found out about how he perceives having worn this contraption on his head for over 10 years and how it allows a colorblind person to kind of hear color because it makes these different sounds when it interacts with different colors, and how he described this sense of being superhuman, and knowing that already with my iPhone, I feel superhuman. So how is that feeling going to evolve as we enter into, things like, the augmented reality headsets that are coming out, and how when the smart objects start to proliferate and our ability as a human being to have hyper awareness increases, and what does that mean for the storyteller whose job is to kind of ground us in this sense of emotion and what it means to be human. And then interestingly, this was a project that we didn't support. I think it was at Tribeca, but this also, we're trying to understand what does it mean to have this mediated relationship through a machine to find your own humanity. In this project, these robots were released in festivals, and the footage that these robots, they did these interviews with people, and the footage that they caught was in some ways more vulnerable and more revealing about the inner life of the people that were participating than a lot of documentary filmmakers could get in a lifetime of capturing interviews on video. So maybe it's not just that it'll take away our humanity, this idea of turning into a world of artificial intelligence and machines, but maybe there is a way of designing that future that is human-centered and actually makes us feel more human. So obviously there's a lot of money being invested in all of this, and so why is Sundance here? Well, at the very core, our mission is to support the artists and to follow the artists as they kind of navigate these new aspects of the communication architecture to tell story. But fundamentally, I think it's even deeper than that. I think it's deeper than just seeing how they use the technologies that are emerging. I think that it is critical that artists are actually at the center of the technological shift, that they are designing our future along with the engineers and the MBAs, because that is how I think we'll have the best chance of having, you know, a society that addresses some of the concerns that have come up earlier today that Aaron was talking about those things that he's worrying about. The artists do that worrying in a way that is very unique and really essential to the process of designing our futures. And this really became an important kind of soapbox issue for me. About a year and a half ago, when we were working with MIT Media Lab, we did a residency program there where we put 7 storytellers in the social computing group under the leadership of Sepp Kamvar, who's one of our artists and also the key researcher at MIT, formerly from Google. And in that process, in one of our initial conversations, he said, it's important for us to bring storytellers into this process of what does it mean to, you know, what is the future of social computing, because code is the new superpower. Code creates a social process, and that social process creates our world. And when he said that, that really struck me as a very provocative statement. I don't come from coding. I'm a dancer by trade. That's my initial creative art form, was dance, and then moved into theater, and it moved into directing and creating, and kind of going in that path. And I intersected with technology when it made sense because of how technology had evolved in our culture and how the arts and storytelling had to evolve with it. But the idea that code is the new superpower was really concerning in some ways. He talked about things like food trucks and Twitter and Uber and potential green spaces as kind of ways of that code would eventually allow us to have a different future physiologically in terms of industry, in terms of sociological constructs. But for me, being a woman of color who's not part of the technology world, fundamentally didn't come from that background, there was a feeling of vulnerability to those who design that code, right? Especially when we know that the statistics are that women and people of color are by far not part of the process of designing that code. And then we put a woman who is an amazing journalist into that process. And she went around for her month residency at MIT and just asked computer scientists one question: what is an algorithm? And this is a journalist who is a Fulbright scholar. You know, she's worked at the LA Times and all these different prestigious newspapers. And she had this revelation that, oh, you know, code has its own bias and its own framing, because it's essentially the programmer asks a question and constructs the algorithm to answer that. But the way that you construct that question has its own framing and its own biases. And I was like, whoa, I hadn't really considered that. As a journalist, she just took whatever the algorithm spit out as data, she took it as truth and as the fundamental objective thing that she could build her story on, right? And so this was a first part of my life. Oh, okay, so it's important that we know who's making the code, how they're asking the questions, so that the framing, just as complicated as a lens is on journalism or framing and storytelling and media representation, that's just as complicated as it is who's designing that code, right? So we have to really think about that from a critical place. Then Aaron actually introduced me to his boss at the time, Robert Wong, and I got a chance to go spend some time at Google Creative Lab in New York. And Robert was phenomenal. I had an amazing time speaking with him. And then he said something very provocative to me. He said that artists are just a pair of hands in the tech industry. It's really run by the MBAs and the engineers. And now I have an MBA and I have a BFA, so, you know, love to the MBAs in the world and the engineers in the world. But he was concerned that artists were being very much marginalized inside of the tech world, and knowing how powerful the tech community is in designing that future world, and now understanding that it's not only women and people of color that are marginalized, but now artists are also marginalized in that world, raised another flag. And I was like, oh, wow. it's really important for us to think about how we're creating this convergence between art and technology, and diversifying that thought so that more people can be part of constructing what will be our future. And then finally, the kind of third piece of the puzzle was when I was at the School World Forum last year at Oxford, and I was sitting next to the head of a futurist department at arguably the #1 technology company in the world, and I won't say who. He was a sweetheart of a man, and his whole job was to construct the future, office buildings, homes, to design what we imagine the future to be, to help set the strategy for this global, really powerful technology company. And when he showed me a 12-minute video of what that future looked like, it was very impressive. It was predominantly white and Asian, but so there was like still that kind of, that gap. But the technology was phenomenal, but it was kind of missing something. There was something that wasn't quite there. And when I turned to him, I said, wow, do you have any artists on your team? And he looked, he said, oh my God, we don't. And I was like, well, how are you imagining the future if you don't have anyone from the arts or the humanities participating in that process? And he goes, I never thought about that before. That's a blind spot, And so for me, I was like, wow, that's kind of dangerous, right? Because those blind spots, as we know, become very dangerous. I don't know if you guys, when I was in my graduate program, in my MBA program, we had to do a case study. We had to read a case study and really analyze the Columbia, because what they found when they did all of the looking back as to why this explosion happened, they found that it was those blind spots. It was the groupthink. It was a lack of diversity of thought, because they had such a stringent structure in place that people that had something to say that was a little bit counter to the main, they kind of got silenced, right? So now what do we know the artists do? Artists are the ones that don't remain silent, right? Artists are the ones that are gonna call it out like it is, are gonna respond and react and help us to reveal those blind spots. And so I think, well, we're smart people. We'll think broader than that. We won't allow our future to kind of head down that road. And then I think about past moments of our blind spots, right? So the industrial age was phenomenal for productivity, for efficiency. We wouldn't be where we are now as a society, as an advanced modern society, without the industrial age. But yet, at the same time, we have films that came out, Josh Fox's film about how to say goodbye to the earth, because of the blind spot that we may have had 100 years ago as we're racing towards productivity and efficiency, and maybe not considering those outliers, those marginalized voices that might have said, maybe we should consider the environment in this race to productivity and efficiency. So I feel like at this point in time, we have an opportunity to create a critical intervention in our race into our future right now, and make sure that we have the Jane Jacobs in the world that countered the Robert Moseses. I think we need Robert Moseses and we need Jane Jacobs, but I think the artists being part and being central to this technology shift, having the storytellers be central to this technology shift, will allow us to find those blind spots so we don't lose something like the values of community and the values of green space that Jane Jacobs inserted into that idea of what the modern New York City was going to be. And I think about artists specifically. Scott Snibbe is one of our creative advisors and has been very inspirational to me. He said when he first got his Apple computer, he saw just a black space and this little cursor, and he saw infinity. He saw possibility. He saw, this amazing ability for anything and everything to happen in that black space with that little cursor. And then this happened. And he said, no, they boxed the universe into a desktop. So we're now talking about this idea of framing. And I was at a dinner with at South by Southwest a couple of weeks ago, and I was sitting with an AR company, and they were talking about AR and the future of computing interfaces, and they were like, can you believe we're gonna be able to do emails like this? I was like, why are we doing emails like this? Why can't we do sign language or do a dance to do our emails? I mean, why do we have to be constructed in the idea of bringing back the keyboard that doesn't exist there, right? So that's why I think it's important to have these artists make sure that we don't put another desktop as the only way to interface with what our future is. And Scott went on to create the Bjork Biophilia app, where he said when the tablet came out, when iPad came out, the universe opened back up to him, and he created this beautiful, fluid, gorgeous, cinematic, artistic interface with which to navigate the data, the imagery, the story, the song of Bjork. Now, just one last blind spot, and I know I'm a little bit over time here. It's really important for us to consider how we are catalyzing the future of storytelling specifically. How are we innovating on the art and form of storytelling specifically? Because when we have blind spots around something as powerful as storytelling, it can really create some serious damage. And I grew up with a father that would always tell me that reality of man is his thought. So if reality of man is his thought, and storytelling is one of the fundamental ways that we construct our thoughts and construct our sense of what reality is, storytelling is probably one of the most powerful tools of the human existence for perpetuating the advancement of civilization, for sharing our knowledge, and for kind of fundamentally defining what it means to be human. In the very beginning of film, as a film institution, as a film community, we have to bear the burden of part of our birth story, which is that the very first feature film that ever existed was also one of the most racist pieces of media that ever existed. And there was a perpetuation of the story of black men, particularly as being the boogeyman, which has all kinds of political reasons as to why. And then if reality of man is his thought, and story is one of the fundamental ways that we construct our thoughts, and it leads to, even today, they redid the doll test just a few years ago, and we're still trapped in those stereotypical narratives that have kind of seeded American consciousness from those old stories, such as the medium of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And they're still preferring, and this is just one example of how powerful story is, but how also it can have a counterintuitive effect, and how it can lead to even current day challenges with how we perceive each other. And then you have artists that are trying to break open all that space, right? So this is a project that I was involved in that actually worked so far, it kind of created this counter tension against that particular narrative, that particular blind spot. And instead of constructing stereotypical identities, it actually exploded them to create this sense of breaking open the monolithic idea of an identity group. We've seen ideas of virtual reality, which the prototype of the Rift was at Sundance in 2012, with a project called Hunger in Los Angeles that promoted or created such sense of empathy that people came out of there with tears in their eyes over a man that was going into a diabetic coma because the food banks in Los Angeles were running out of food. We're seeing augmented reality being used to help us understand the loss of coral reefs. This is another one, that wall-width piece that is also connected to a dome presentation. We're seeing virtual reality being used to help people get a sense of what does it mean to be in the perspective of the woman or of the man at a college party that go through the scenario of a date rape. And I had grown men coming out of this. This is probably one of the lowest quality VR pieces we've ever showed at Sundance in terms of production quality, but I had grown men, powerful men, heads of studios coming out with tears in their eyes, coming out of this project because they said, oh my God, I gotta go call my daughter, or I gotta go call my son, and started to understand what the psychological conditions are that lead to this particular moment of the epidemic of date rape we have in our culture. Same thing, she came back next year with police brutality. We're seeing the Jane Jacobs, Robert Moses story. We're seeing the immigrant story. We're seeing the idea of the farmer's story. We're seeing the idea of weather patterns, all these things that artists, what does it mean to be in the fog of war during a revolution and having to make moral and political and story choices that you couldn't have that agency within a 2D film that the gaming environment is allowing people to experience in a documentary construct. What does it mean to have the identity of a black male that is transgendered? What does it mean to kind of understand the data around dating culture and online dating and telling us more about what it means to want to be loved. So I'm showing you all these images to say that it's been a real privilege and an honor to be in the position that we are at New Frontier, to to follow these artists into an incredibly scary, unknown space, and also trying to find constantly what is the soul in the machine? How do the arts and technology converge to help us to actually feel more human? And that is the end, because I'm way over time. Thank you.